Well, good morning and welcome. This is the FarmDoc Daily Live webinar, Coronavirus and Ag Today, getting the 2020 crop planted. Our specialists for the day include Emerson Nafziger of Crop Sciences, Illinois Extension agronomist, along with Gary Schnitke, who's the soybean industry chair in agricultural strategy, ag economist from right here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. Gary, I think I'll turn things right over to you for the morning. Good morning to you. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, I'm going to take a couple minutes and just keep us updated on what's happening on the price side. If you wouldn't mind, answer our poll here, and we're asking you what you think expected. What do you expect crash prices to be for corn in July 2020? So looking a couple months ahead, where do you think those will be? And we'll get a feel for how optimistic or pessimistic our audience is. We got about 45% of the vote in, and so continue to do that. I'm going to take you through a little bit of what's happened on cash price side, and then take you through what that might mean for our market year average prices for 2019, and then what that could mean for 2019 commodity title payments. Here's our vote. 15% of you believe it's going to be below $3, 35% $3 to $3.20. So that's about where we're at right now. And 41% of you think it's going to go up a bit, and 7 and 9% of you are pretty optimistic, at least compared to where we're at currently. Again, what I'm going to do here is take you through where we're looking at cash prices right now. Cash prices right now, and this was as of April 15th, this would be Central Illinois cash corn and soybean prices. These are reported by AMS. 307 for corn, 832 for soybeans. And again, that was April 15th and a cash price. Those obviously have come down quite a bit from earlier in the year. We were over 380 for corn and close to $9 for soybeans, and we've seen those steadily decline. We've used those prices to come up with estimates of the 2019-2020 market year average price, and then what that would mean for revenue. Pre-COVID-19, we were looking at corn prices $385, $875 for soybeans, $455 for wheat. Those happened to be the forecast WASDE made in February and what was reported at the Ag Outlook conference. After all of the events that have happened, we've re-estimated those prices using methodologies put forward by ERS. We come up with the $355 price for corn now, and that would be based on futures prices going forward. $855 for soybeans, $464 for wheat. So we've seen corn prices come down, market year average 30 cents, soybeans 20 cents, and wheat up a bit, 9 cents. If we take those changes by our 2019 Illinois yield, we would get a decline in revenue of $54 for corn, $11 for soybeans, and up 6 for wheat. That $54 decline in revenue would be associated with roughly the 30 to 40% of corn, and roughly the same for soybeans that haven't been sold yet. We're probably looking at closer to 30%, and those price declines come into play. So minus $54 based on corn that has been in storage on average for the first part of the year. That will change our payment estimates on 2019 ARC PLC, which will happen in October 2019. That also will be a much needed cash flow. We would now estimate corn making a $20 per base acre payment in Illinois. Still, most counties will be zero if they selected ARC County. Soybeans, that $855 would not make payments. ARC County would increase the payments or have them stay the same. We re-estimated those payments, and you here, this slide shows what those payments would be. You will still see some counties with a lot of zeros in it. But we've seen some pretty substantial increases in those counties where the payments would have happened. And a number of those counties didn't have an increase because they were already at the maximum. And that one would be Champaign County, for example. Anyway, what we're looking at is serious losses on 2019 revenue, particularly on corn. We'll see some increases in 2019. ARC and PLC will make up a small portion of those losses in revenue. And again, those revenue losses will depend on how much of the crop is left unsold. And you can look at our Farm Doc Daily for today after it's up later today and see what those are. So we'll move on to our, go ahead, Todd.
I was going to say you can find that at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu later today and check it out. And as Gary started to allude to, we'll move on into the rest of our webinar as well here. Go ahead and take this poll. How much of the 2020 corn crop will be planted in Illinois during the next 2 weeks or by the end of April? Less than 25%, between 25 and 50%. Between 50 and 75%, and over 75%. It'll be interesting to see how that turns out. And I wish we knew where everybody was, so if there were regional differences as well. I'll bet that Emerson Nafziger, Illinois Extension agronomist, has got some ideas about that, and he'll give us some input as to what that might look like. And I think we're just about to the point where we can go ahead and close this out. We're not moving along in what we see in terms of the number of people that are voting still. So there we go. Half of you think that between 25% and 50% will be planted between now and the beginning of May. 25% say that 50 to 75% will do that. Emerson Nafziger is here. He's an extension agronomist at the University of Illinois. Good morning to you, Emerson. Thanks for being with us. What's your number on how much corn will be planted between now and May 1?
Well, I probably would have, not just because of the majority, but the 25 to 50. You know, our median amount of corn planted, the 50% planting date is about May 1st. So we'd be right on schedule with that. And as I look at it, there's probably not too much reason why we won't get there.
Go ahead and start your slide set for me,
Okay,
please.
well, good morning, everybody. And normally I took this assignment figuring we'd be sitting here watching the buckets of rain fall, and it really hasn't happened that way, which is good for us, I guess. We're always happy to make progress in April on planting, and I think we're going to be making some this year as well. Certainly, it doesn't look like a repeat of last year when we were sitting here at this date. You know, not necessarily sopping wet, but wet enough and cool enough. And cool and wet are the combination that we dread the most in April, because that means that nothing much is going to happen. We're not going to plant and it's not going to dry. So let's move forward and talk about this. I'll move through this fairly quickly. If you saw my article about planting, well, you kind of know what's coming, but I added a little bit for this. And the current status is, as of April 12th, or last Sunday, according to NASS, we were only 1% planted. Our 5-year average is 2%. We finally shed 2012 as a year, looking back at the last 5-year average, and so they're more reasonable now because we were so far ahead of normal in 2012 that you know, it skewed the numbers for the 5 years after that. Only 3% of the U.S. corn crop was planted, and that's against an average of 4%. Illinois, an average of 2% on that date. So the rest of the Corn Belt really hadn't made any progress to speak of. Only Indiana reported any, and that's the 1% that you see there. So they've been able to get some done. Typically, when we get a pretty fast start, as we did in some areas last week, the week before Easter, these numbers probably are undershot a little bit. So I would expect that we probably had a couple of percent or 3% maybe planted. We heard stories that some people were finished with corn. By now, probably some people are finished with soybeans as well. A lot of progress was made this week as the rain held off. And pretty good chunk of Illinois got wet enough to hold it off this morning. And it's, of course, still cool. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. No soybean was reported as being planted as of the end of last week, but there probably was a little bit here and there. Illinois reported 4.7 days suitable for field work, so that part of it is generally positive if we can get those in April. But we expect those numbers to jump pretty well this week. I'm not going to, well, I guess if you want me to, but you know, we started to show over on the right, it shows the short topsoil moisture, and that's the first that had appeared through the month of March. I don't think any of it was indicated as being short. That will go up maybe a little bit, but it takes the kind of temperatures we had there for a few days in early April to really get those topsoils drying out, and so people look at them and say, well, that's, you know, I could use a little bit of rain, and I'm sure people said that last week already. So the numbers will go up this week, and this is, sorry, I thought I missed one there. This is kind of the story. You can look at these maps every day if you want to, and it has it for the last number of days. And on the left, we see what the 2-inch, I use the, sorry, that's 4-inch soil temperature under bare soil. And in the middle, I've got the 2-inch. It doesn't really matter. They're in the same trend. And what we saw from April 7th, which was the end of the high temperature period that we had and accumulated most of our growing degree days so far for the month, we had temperatures at the 4-inch depth at 10 a.m. In the 50s and lows up to almost 60. And after the cool down that's taken place, and I just put a couple of sites there, you can look at those as well on the State Water Survey website, that we're now down in the 40s, in some cases in the upper 30s. If I had looked at it this morning, they'd have been even a little bit lower. So certainly soil temperatures have gone down. At one time, we would have said, well, wait till it's 50 degrees at the 2-inch depth. And if we were all doing that, we'd all still be waiting, except they did come up there for a few days in early April. And the moisture did what you already know happened. It's really been drying out pretty well, at least in central and southern Illinois. Those numbers, if you look at them, you know, basically anything above 0.4, that's sort of weight for volume. So that's, you know, 40% of the volume of soil would be weight of water in that case, and that's pretty wet. If it gets up to 40.45 and higher, it's sopping wet. But as over time, then certainly here in East Central Illinois, Bonneville is just west of town here, and I use that one because it's more in the agricultural soil than the one closer here in town. But you can see what's happened to soil moisture, and that's a little bit unusual to see that in April. But of course, we haven't had rainfall. I don't think we've totaled an inch here yet, and much of the state hasn't for the month of April. That's probably going to change some, but we've seen those forecasts kind of, you know, for a lot of rain, and then they sort of back off. And that's a pattern we like to see this time of year. Come July, we won't be very happy to see that. So that's one of the things we have to keep in mind. But our soils have dried up to the point, and a good thing about them drying up at this point in time is that, you know, they're likely to be dry later on. So we can turn really wet, and we did at the end of April in 2017. But normally having dry conditions, soil conditions, and good planting conditions by the middle of April in some places mean that those are going to be there for us before it gets really late in planting. So do we go full speed ahead or not? Generally, I would say yes, certainly in central and southern Illinois. The soils in northern Illinois, and I didn't really point that out on that one, but they are still relatively wet. You can see here that up at the DeKalb site, you know, they're up at around that 0.38. That's not very dry. And that's pretty much the case, as you can see in northern Illinois. But they're cooler there, they're wetter there, but they're not super wet, and let's hope that they don't get super wet. So there's little reason not to plant, but let's sort of put it in perspective. With the cool soils and a cool forecast, we know that germination and emergence are going to be very slow. I put growing degree day accumulations there from the 1st to the 8th of April at Champaign. We had 71 growing degree days. For the next 8 days, we had a total of 21, ending with yesterday. And yesterday we didn't get any. We didn't get any the day before. So we're really going to town on that. And the forecast temperatures just over the next 2 weeks gets us up to 94 more. But the total, as you can see there, for the month would only be about 186. And our average for April is higher than that. It's not great. I mean, it's not a warm month. I think our average runs around 250, and a little bit less north, a little bit more south. But we never get a huge chunk of growing degree days. So we're looking at less than 7 or 8% that we would get for the season come in April. So one way to look at that is that April doesn't give us very much in terms of growing temperatures for the crop. It's been very unusual when we've had April give us early planting and then get a lot of growth in the crop. And the last big scale time that we saw that was in 2012, and then it forgot to rain after that. So the conclusions on that is corn planted in that first week of April is going to take about it's going to come up in the next couple of weeks if we get temperatures that are average. But that planted now is going to take roughly 20 days to come up. We need about 120 growing degree days to come up. And so you can see why I predict this here. We get 94 over the next 2 weeks. And corn that was planted yesterday is going to be germinated and probably approaching the surface, but may not be breaking through yet. And that means that on average, we're probably looking at first week of May for corn planted now. And of course, the later we plant, although temperatures are supposed to return to normal, and then we'll get it up in the normal time. But it'll be a waiting game. It always is, often is when we plant in April. The good news is that the soils are not really wet, so we should get good emergence from this. Mostly I talk about corn here, but soybeans are not too different in that regard. Seed quality of both is really generally very good, and corn comes up out of conditions now that probably back in my youth at least, we would never have considered planting into soils that cool. Don't get me wrong, seed, if they could vote, they'd say put me in warmer soil than this because I want to get up and get growing. And we certainly like to see that with the crop. And we're not going to see that with the crop that gets planted in April this year. But hopefully the germination will be good, emergence should be good, and we'll have a crop that's ready in May then to take off and grow. Moderate rainfall would be helpful in the drier areas, and that's what we got at least most of here overnight this last night. So more helpful certainly if temperatures rose, and our big concern we would have is if it socks in with wet, a lot of rainfall and then turns cool. And that's what led us in 2017 to a lot of replant in this part of the state and going south from here. Much of northern Illinois soils are still wet. There's probably been a few places in some soils that have been able to go, but that and slow growing degree day accumulation is going to diminish the benefit of early planting. And I guess that's the way I think of it. We like to get the crop in, but April is not a month usually where this crop makes a huge amount of growth. Any issues with these conditions? Well, corn planted by April 5th or 6th will emerge with the soil still cool, probably the last week of April. Cool soil tends to stretch out the time, not the growing degree days, between first and last plants to emerge. The point I'm trying to make here is that the uniformity that we love to see, every plant sort of showing in rows at the same time. When we have cool soils that it's emerging from, that doesn't happen. At least it's not quite as visually appealing to us. And that's simply because growing degree days or soil temperatures, really, and growing degree days of air temperature and soil temperature, we've found that it doesn't make a whole lot of difference which one of those you measure, because soil temperatures tend to follow air temperatures pretty well. So the growing degree days between the first and last plants to emerge are probably not going to be very different. But in terms of hours, that when soils are cool and air is cool, that does make a difference. So we'll just hope for that. And that non-uniformity of emergence is something that people fret a lot about. I just want to make sure you understand that that's a function of what the temperatures are. If we get uneven emergence when the daytime temperatures are in the 70s, then we have something else going on, either seed quality issues or something that's affecting how well those plants came up. Frost is not very much. Oh, I did make my last point there that once it warms up, then that size difference, because it's not really a very large one, it will diminish really quickly, and that stand can look really uniform and nice. Frost isn't too much of a concern for us. I don't know, there could have been some corn way in southern Illinois that got planted, could get a little frost, but it's not a major concern, the frost that we got this week, except it got, I think the official low here yesterday was 22 degrees, which is kind of was a new record, I believe. So there's not any forecast for the rest of the month, at least looking at the forecast right now. Little concern about direct frost injury of either crop that's planted now. Corn planted in April is taking up or will take up cool water as it germinates. I noticed Bob Nielsen at Purdue wrote about this morning again, put that out. There's this phenomenon called imbibitional chilling injury. We've seen it most when corn gets planted and then it snows 4 inches on it and the cold water dribbles down and it takes up cold water. This is it's a real thing. Corn seeds, the first water they take in, if it's got temperatures down in the 40 degrees or less, it can damage some of the membranes. And there isn't much we can do about it. But I just gave you the advice here to check unemerged plants soon after the first plants in a field emerge and see if those that aren't emerging, see if their growth is normal or not. What it normally does in these seedlings is just sort of twist them up, and they'll sort of corkscrew or grow in circles and this sort of thing. So it's not a pretty sight, and most of them don't come up. And we're not sure if the ones that do come up are gonna develop completely normally. So that's one thing just to watch. Where we got snow this week and corn was planted, it's a possibility. It hasn't had warm temperatures that take up that first water, the corn that's been planted in the last week. So it's just something to watch. Don't get real concerned about it. I think corn is affected by this more than soybeans. All those soybeans, they have to pull their cotyledons out of the soil, so they have a real task ahead of them, and a lot of things can go wrong once that seed coat breaks open. When soils are dried out after they're worked wet, cloudiness can be an issue, and that's something to watch for. Certainly nothing, I think, that we'd wait to plant to see if it rains. And we won't talk about this one because I think pretty much everywhere this is being resolved as we speak. It could be, our planters are so good at placing the seed that we really don't worry that much about it anymore. but I do know that some people that got out and worked soil and then watched it dry out for a week, there probably was a little bit of cloudiness in some of that, and we don't often see that these days. Some soils can also form crusts after heavy rains and followed by rapid drying, so it really bakes a crust on this. And we don't expect such conditions in April this year. May, we don't know what that will bring, but heavy rainfall is the one thing. It makes the surface soils sort of run together, and we won't worry about that until we get it. But it's certainly a concern when we have cool soils and a fairly lengthy emergence time. It just gives time for more things to go wrong. Most of you have seen these at some point or other, but this is our sort of combined data from soybean and corn trials that we've run over the last 10 years or so in Illinois. And sort of to our surprise, I suppose, we never really expected this. We saw that corn and soybeans respond very similarly to planting date, at least through the end of May. And we won't talk in a lot of detail about this. There's 39 corn trials and 28 soybean trials. Each one had 4 planting dates. You can kind of see the range over which they were spread. We never really started this to try to plant soybeans back as early or earlier than corn. That's why we're planting it in the middle of April. That's when we intended to plant. It isn't that, if we were starting it over, we might try to plant sometimes in March or at least early April, and we just didn't do that. The point I'd make from that is soybeans, that you can see about any time they were planted in April was up at 100% of their maximum yield level for that site. And I don't think that planting back in March would have raised that to some new plateau. So we get people talking about planting soybeans in March. Soybeans are as hardy as corn pretty much once they get up. They're not killed by frost very easily. But you have to really ask the question, are you getting an advantage for planting early? And the occasional time that you may need to replant is something that we keep in mind as well. But it takes about, it takes a while to get down. These curves are not as steep as they would have been with 20 or 30 years ago. And it's because hybrids and varieties just do better. And so, that's something we can be really pleased about. We can see how variable this is as we get back to late May planting. I mean, we had some places where we had the maximum yields for the location at those planting dates. More commonly, there is a yield drop, but you can see how variable it is. So both crops benefit from early planting. I guess my point here is that early May is still early. If you look at this first 10 days of May, there's still a lot of those that are up there towards the maximum. And our yield losses for both crops reach about 10% by May 25th. So that's something to keep in mind, and you can use that. I put it into just a different format here. It's the same data, just reformatted, and shows you that, yield losses with planting delays are pretty slow through mid-May. And, it's only 5 or 6% here by the 15th or so of May. And then they increase some after that. But the yields do not fall off the table like they might have at one time. We don't have much data for planting corn past early June. So that's why there's no bar there. We did get some data last year, and Pioneer generously shared some plot data with me. We had asked people for data and never really got very much, saying, what did your field yield? When did you plant it? And, what maturity did you use? But I just put these together to show you all of their plot data. And they had some from pretty much every county. And the vertical lineups you see there is they had different maturities. We didn't learn much from soybean maturity. It never made much difference. Corn maturity there on the left, if we got here back to early June for planting, then in northern Illinois, the earlier maturing hybrids did relatively better. For the rest of the state, it didn't make much difference. But the reason I'm showing you these is they actually line up pretty well with our U of I data I was just showing you. And that made us feel pretty good. If we got down to, you know, a yield loss here of about a third, 75 down to about 50, but we had to get out to past the end of June to get there. So, you know, that's encouraging. Not enough data for corn that late, but you can see there by the middle of June, we were still down to, we still averaged, at least the line told us we were there at still around the 200 bushel yield level. And the high in that trial was about 235. So for the late planting we had last year, pretty good yields. This kind of shows you that this is our 50% planted date, and this is, I plotted here the deviation from trend line yield over the last 40 years. And I put the dates on these down here because they're really the only ones that skewed very far away from the zero. In other words, trend line yields were plus or minus 20 bushel, except for about 3 years here. And 2012, 1988 to 1983, and you can see that 2012 was record early planting and 2019 was record late planting. The point here is that, you know, if you run a line through these points, it's pretty much flat at zero. And we would expect it to be a average about zero, but we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be flat. And that just tells you that when we get this crop planted is not a major determinant of how much it's going to yield for that year. 2019, as late as it was planted, we were only about 8 bushel off of trend line yield, below trend line yield last year. Here's the real difference maker when it comes to corn yields. It's how much it rains. And middle of the summer. And average rainfall is about 4 inches for Illinois, just over 4 inches in July. And you can see here, if you had that or more, you were pretty much up around trend line, averaging above trend line, actually about 7 bushel. And as you got less than that, then yields really fell apart. So we'll come back and do a little more thinking, but just to let you know that planting date, you know, we need to get the crop in when we can get it in. But what happens in the middle of the summer is always going to be more important than when we got this crop planted. 2019 was actually a little bit below normal. In some regions, quite a bit below normal in rainfall, July rainfall last year, but it still yielded pretty well. So population, I'll just mention these very briefly because it's sort of a sidebar. Everybody has sort of decided what they're going to plant out there. And I'm just showing you over 44 trials over 7 years. Our best population for corn was about 33,300. That's plants. Take a little bit more than that, maybe dropping 35 or so. And the yield at that was 229. If we drop back to 30,000 over all these trials, we only dropped about 4 bushels of yield. So that's back here, right here. And if we went up to 40,000, we only added a bushel. So basically the response is really flat as it goes above that. And you know, the plateau between 30 and 40 doesn't have very much change in altitude. So, you know, as long as we're in that planting range, we get that population, we're probably pretty good in most Illinois soils. We just have not seen a big benefit, usually more yield loss going from, say, 35 to 45 than yield gain. Soybeans, our best plant stand that we found over 25 sites was 107,000 plants. That brought us to 71 bushels per acre, and this is on a return to seed, so it's a dollar value because we want to find the high point on that curve to show us what the best return, at what seeding rate do we get the most bang for our seed dollar, and that was at that standard rate. That would take planting about 134,000 seeds per acre. So we're good on that. And I did a little bit of, I went back and dug up some data and reanalyzed it. I had a planting depth study back 20 years ago, and this was averaged over 3 years. So I wanted to prove to you that I had some data on this. And the reason I brought this up is we're now seeing some moisture sense planting depth controls and variable down pressure. And I guess I kind of can appreciate the technology of that, but it's not everybody that's really been having a problem because they don't have that. And when I asked one equipment person if they actually plant 3 inches deep, if that's where the moisture was, he said yes. And that's a concern. We really don't have a good reason to put seed 3 inches deep in any soil except maybe sandy soils. And that would probably work there, but I would be really afraid. Even though you can see on this data, the thing is stretched out, so it doesn't show huge yield losses. 2 out of the 3 years, we had significantly lower yields at 3 inches deep than at shallower depths, and it wasn't because we didn't have stand there. It was because they just get behind a little bit. Some of them, struggle, don't establish their crown quite at the right depth, and so on. It's just not something that gives us any safety in silt loam, silty clay loam soils. So any adjustments this year? Well, a slow start to soil mineralization comes with cool soil. So corn's need for early nitrogen should be supplied with nitrogen, and that's with fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. If you don't have any on before you plant, or we could put on UAN broadcast, you could place it 2 by 2 or dribble onto or near the planted row at 10 to 15 gallons of UAN. 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen, maybe stabilized urea, broadcast at planting, or place 2 by 2. Very few people can place dry, or dropped on top of the row after planting. Some people may need to get creative, and you might think I'm sort of, worrying about this and don't need to, but we have found that if the crop does not have enough nitrogen near the row when after it emerges and starts to establish its permanent root system, yield potential can be reduced that you can't get back later on with putting more nitrogen on. So when soils are cool, that's where we worry about this the most, because even in our higher organic matter soils, as long as they're staying down in the 50-degree range, they are not mineralizing very much nitrogen from the organic matter at all. So that's the only thing I had to keep in mind. Low rainfall following early anhydrous application could result in some release of ammonia in the soil, and that can move up, and very low concentrations can kill a seed or ding the roots on a seedling. And we do not see this very often, and we really don't see it very often in higher organic matter prairie soils, but it doesn't mean that we can't. And if we get rainfall before emergence, that usually keeps this damage away. And the soils will dry slowly, so the release they have to dry for this ammonia to be released. If they stay damp, that's not going to be a problem. I don't know if that moved ahead or what. Any other adjustments should just be ones that improve chances for emergence of a uniform stand. These will be field and equipment specific. Well, the last point on this, if it looks doubtful that you can plant this seed, and that make sure that ammonia is not going to move up. Not planting on top of a knife track is the only sure thing to do. And we've had some people in the past actually do tillage. Tillage will normally prevent that because it disperses that band. What if it is May before we finish planting? No need to panic. Yeah, I told you that yields are good to outstanding when corn and soybeans are planted in the first half of May. They start to decline then. But we don't have to do anything with regard to maturity of hybrid variety, seeding rate, these kinds of things, if we're planting the middle of May instead of the middle of April. When we get to the end of May, then we'll have to think again. But soils will be warmer when planting in May, which means faster and probably more uniform emergence, and those will help get mineralization started, but young corn plants are still probably going to need fertilizer nitrogen near the roots by the time they're a few inches tall. Things go badly for April planted crops, consider May replanting if soybean stands are less than 90 and 95,000 per acre and corn stands are less than 25 to 28,000 uniformly distributed. I know that we have a chart on, what's your stand and what will it be if you replant today. I'm on the process of just sort of throwing that away. We do not expect to see very much difference in response to planting date or population as we get later with planting. And so I just think that, if you've got enough stand there, basically we're just going to leave it and be done with it.
So if you've got questions for Emerson, go ahead and tap those in at the moment. We'll take a few minutes here to maybe answer some of those questions. We would like to thank our sponsors for this FarmDoc webinar series. They include TIA, the Center for Farmland Research, right here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the U of I, in the College of Aces, Compeer Financial, Farm Credit Illinois, GrowMark, and the Illinois Corn Growers Association, of course, along with the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics in the College of Aces as well. Upcoming webinars include Monday at 11 o'clock, a look at the impact of coronavirus, the pandemic, on food prices and the retail food sector. We'll talk not only with Scott Irwin from here on campus, but Jason Lusk, who is at Purdue University. And we'll probably get into some of the supply chain things as well. And then on Friday of next week, an update on the policy and political outlook for coronavirus. Of course, it's been a couple of weeks since that $2 trillion CARES package was passed. We'll kind of update what that looks like. So now we'll take some quick questions for Emerson and for Gary Schnitke. If you have them, go ahead and tap them out. I've got a couple of things. One comment came in, Emerson, as you were talking. Somebody from DeKalb, Illinois said, by the way, he's got 4 inches of snow on the ground, and it's still snowing there this morning. I also checked with Eric Snodgrass from Nutrient Ag Solutions and Agrable to see what he thought conditions would be like over the next 2 weeks. He sent a couple of things to me. The first one, when you look out over the 2-week period, he showed a map to me of systems. There's not much in the Western Corn Belt headed our way, so should not be too bad. And there is a dry area, as you alluded to, Emerson, across the north central part of the state. I think maybe a line from across at Peoria all the way across the state. It varies a little bit, but that's kind of where the driest area of the state might be. I'm wondering about those early planted soybeans. I know a lot of them went in the ground in Logan and Sangamon County. I know some in the Moline area as well. Is there any evidence, Emerson, that planting early soybeans, giving them that additional time during the growing season, provides any agronomic advantage?
Well, that's a good question, but if we get weather like this, they're not making any growth, they're not doing anything. And so having them in the ground, and getting when they come up, then it doesn't matter when you planted them, it's when they come up and can start to grow. I suppose you could say that always having the seeds in the ground by the end of April is not a bad thing, but I don't think that we would see, and I've seen March planting being advocated for soybeans, and that's based on pretty minimal data. Yeah, if we get them up, we'll just breathe a sigh of relief. And one of the reasons we can plant soybeans earlier is that we don't have that expectation that they're going to produce, say, the 95% stand that we expect corn seed to produce. And so we're generally planting enough. Our expectation that I put in on soybean emergence and establishment is about 80%. And it takes quite a bit for us to fall much below that.
Any comment, Emerson, and this one comes from the Ottawa area on killing cover crops. Should you till it or not till it? Some of the cover crop wheat there has not been sprayed to kill it yet because the temperatures just haven't been high enough.
Well, I thought afterwards I maybe should have put something in, but people still talk about planting green into cover crop rye, cereal rye or wheat for corn, and that really bothers me. That strips nitrogen out of the soil, and basically the corn sees that as a weed when it's coming up, and it's a pretty aggressive one when it's way ahead. I would definitely be spraying that out and hopefully getting it to be pretty much dried up by the time we plant. And also maybe considering if we're not doing full width tillage, do strip till or something to try to get those roots out of the corn row, and also get some nitrogen there, because those plants are not going to get nitrogen otherwise, and the soil has had the nitrogen taken out by the cover crop. So cover crops are effective at doing that. Cover crop, grass crops, cereal rye and annual ryegrass, but they are not a friend of the corn plant, and we've seen some pretty good yield hits when cover crop rye gets too big.
I produced the Nutrient Loss Reduction podcast along with a couple of the other extension folks that guide the questions I ask and some of the researchers that I talked to. And we just posted one yesterday that talked about using strip till in cover crops and allowing that soil to warm up. You can search for Nutrient Loss Reduction podcast, willag.org, and you'll find probably all 25 of those episodes, but you can check that out as well. Emerson, what are your thoughts on using sulfur with your planting application of 32% for some nitrogen stabilization?
I would use it as a sulfur source. We're talking about ammonium thiosulfate here, which is pretty commonly available. It's not, we don't really need stabilization if we're putting this under the soil surface anyway for urea containing products like UAN. But as a sulfur source, I'd be more interested in it as that. And the need for sulfur is one of those things that is not very well established, but high yielding crops take up some sulfur. That most of it comes from organic matter, and we don't get much from the power plants anymore. So it's something that a lot of people are thinking about or are actually using now.
And one final question as we wrap up our time together, Emerson. How will cold conditions impact corn and soybeans already planted in the state? You talked about this, but more importantly, does that impact very much from north to south, in your opinion?
Well, just from the fact that it's colder north generally. We don't have good evidence that says that, if it takes the crop 2 to 3 weeks to come up, that it's been set back somehow. I think it depends very much on what happens after that. And that's a weaselly answer, but I would say if we get good warm growing conditions after the crop emerges, then we can pretty much gather that or guess that the crop is going to forget how it was put into those 38-degree soils and should be fine. I think what happens after emergence is going to be more important, but we do have to get them up, get enough of them up, and that's always makes us a little bit nervous. But cooler and drier is better than getting wet and cool, or even dry afterwards, before it's up can keep emergence from being as good as we would like it to be. So Yeah, a long answer, but the cool weather that happens in April is generally not something that has a lasting effect if we can get the good stands and then if the rest of the growing season is favorable.
So I think, and you'll have to help me, Emerson, but Aaron Hager tapped in an answer, I think, to the sulfur question. I just don't recall enough about the production side to know. He said, we suggest caution when ammonium thiosulfate is being applied with burn down herbicides because there's some reports of antagonism that are known. So just one little tidbit there from Aaron. And that's correct, right? I mean, that it's related to the sulfur question.
Well, I'll defer to Aaron on that.
Well, I think that well,
something to preserve.
It's the thiosulfate, right? It's yeah. So okay, good enough. We'll leave it at that.
And it's fine to add it with UAN if you want to. If you're using UAN as a material, we wouldn't typically see that broadcast that way. And if we need an inhibitor, a urease inhibitor, there are better ones than ammonium thiosulfate.
Right. Yes. So Aaron does tell me that's related to the sulfur question. So with that, I think we're all done. Thank you so much, Emerson, for Gary Schnicke, for you being along with the ride for us today as well. Don't forget, we have more upcoming webinars. We talked about those already. You can always find the webinars in our archive at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu, and you can check out our YouTube channel as well. On behalf of the FarmDoc Daily team, thank you so much for today. I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason, your moderator, and Jim Bolts, of course, has been at the controls for the afternoon. Thanks to him, you have a good weekend.